It was late November of 2013 when I drove up to a small hunting cabin deep in the northern part of Minnesota. I had taken a few days off from work to spend some quiet time alone and maybe hunt deer before the snow got too thick. I was 34 at the time, and I had always liked being out in the woods. I thought the stillness would clear my head for a while. The cabin belonged to an old friend of my father who had passed away years earlier. It sat near a narrow dirt road about 15 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by miles of thick pine and birch forest. It wasn't much: one small room, a wood stove, an old table, and a single bed pushed up against the wall. The place had no electricity, no running water, and just an old hand pump outside near a half-collapsed shed. By the time I arrived, the sun was already sinking. The drive had been long and slow because the dirt road was frozen and covered with patches of ice. The temperature had dropped into the low 20s, and everything was quiet except for the sound of wind pushing through the trees. I parked my truck just beside the cabin, unloaded my rifle, sleeping bag, and a few bags of food, and got the wood stove burning. The first night passed quietly. I sat inside, warming my hands over the stove, listening to the faint cracking of logs and the wind outside. The forest always had its own rhythm, far-off snaps of branches, faint rustling in the dark. I wasn't uneasy, but I remember how thick the silence felt when the wind stopped. Out there, even a single sound carried far. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The air inside the cabin was freezing because the fire had gone out overnight. I relit it and stepped outside for a moment. My breath came out in pale clouds. The sky was gray and heavy with low clouds. The forest smelled damp and cold, and the frost on the ground crunched beneath my boots. I followed an old deer trail that started about 50 yards behind the cabin and wound through the trees for miles. The woods were quiet except for the occasional crow. After walking for about an hour, I saw a few tracks, fresh ones, but they seemed to move toward a low marshy area. I followed them a while, but the ground got soft and uneven, so I turned back before I got too far. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something that didn't seem right. My truck door was open. I had locked it before leaving, I was sure of it. The passenger side door was swung wide, and my glove compartment was hanging open. I checked everything quickly. My rifle case was untouched, but my backpack from the passenger seat was gone. Inside that pack had been a flashlight, a folding knife, a small first aid kit, and some jerky and energy bars. Nothing valuable, really, but it bothered me. It was possible someone had been walking through the woods and found my cabin, maybe looking for food or supplies. That part of the state had a few squatters and off-grid types. I tried not to think too much about it, but something about how quiet the woods were that afternoon felt off. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing small noises outside, like something brushing against the cabin wall or crunching slowly across the frozen ground. I told myself it was just deer or raccoons, but every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing outside, listening. When morning came, I stepped out and checked around. There were faint footprints in the frost near the back of the cabin. They looked human boot prints, not animal. They led from the woods to the side of the cabin and then circled toward the pump. I followed them a few yards before they disappeared into the hard ground near the tree line. I started to feel uneasy staying there alone, but I wasn't ready to pack up just yet. I told myself maybe it was just a hunter passing through. Still, I kept my rifle loaded and leaned against the wall the rest of that day. By the third night, I was restless. I'd eaten little, slept less, and the cold was biting through the cracks in the cabin walls. Around midnight, while I was half dozing by the stove, I heard something again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving from the side of the cabin toward the front. I froze, listening. The steps stopped near the window. Then came a faint scraping sound, like fingers dragging across the wood. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the dark outline of the window. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. After what felt like a full minute, the sound stopped. I waited another 5 before I stood up. I didn't go outside. I didn't even look through the window. I just stayed still, listening until the wind started again. When morning came, I checked around again. There were more footprints, clearer this time, right under the window and circling around the side. They weren't mine. The stride was longer, heavier. Someone had been there. That was enough for me. I decided to pack up and leave that afternoon. I loaded everything into the truck, making sure my rifle was on the passenger seat beside me. When I turned the key, the engine barely cranked. Coughed once, twice, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood and checked the battery. It was gone. Someone had taken it. My stomach dropped. I just stood there staring at the empty space where it should have been. There was no way anyone would take a truck battery randomly unless they meant to keep me from leaving. I remember that moment clearly. The wind was cutting through the trees, the air so sharp it made my eyes water, and there was nothing, no traffic, no sound of another engine for miles. I was stuck. I spent the rest of that day inside the cabin, locking the door from the inside with a piece of wood wedged against the frame. Every sound outside made me flinch. As the sun started to set, I tried to plan what I'd do. The nearest main road was about 15 miles away. If I started walking early, I could reach it by late morning, maybe find someone passing by, but it would mean walking through freezing woods in the dark. That night was the worst. The wind picked up again, slamming against the walls, and I could hear something moving out there. Slow steps, then silence, then steps again. I held the rifle in my hands the whole time, staring at the door. Around 3 a.m., I heard a thump, like something being dropped near the porch. I waited, barely breathing. After a few minutes, it was quiet again. When daylight came, I opened the door. Lying just a few feet from the steps was my missing backpack. Everything inside was there, the knife, flashlight, even the snacks. But the jerky had been chewed on. I don't know if it was by an animal or a person, but the edges were torn and wet. I didn't wait around. I grabbed what I could carry, slung the rifle over my shoulder, and started walking toward the main road. The sky was pale gray, the ground frozen hard, and my hands were shaking from the cold and nerves. Every few minutes I looked back, half expecting to see someone following. I never did, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It took me nearly 6 hours to reach the road. My legs were numb, and my throat felt raw from breathing the cold air. When I finally saw a pickup coming down the road, I waved until it stopped. The man inside let me ride into town. I didn't explain much, just said my truck had broken down and I needed help. When I went back with a mechanic later that afternoon, the cabin looked exactly the same. The door was still shut. The windows were intact, but there were new footprints near my truck. Different sizes, some overlapping the old ones. The battery was still gone. We towed the truck out that evening. I never went back after that. For weeks after, I kept thinking about the nights I'd spent there, the sounds I'd heard, the footprints circling the cabin, and the way my pack had been returned like that. I still don't know if it was someone living out there, someone just playing with me, or something darker, human, but wrong in some way. All I know is that it wasn't the woods that scared me. It was the thought that, for those 3 nights, someone had been out there watching every move I made, waiting for something. And the worst part was, I never saw a single person. Sometimes, when I drive through that part of the state, I still look at the turnoff that leads toward that old dirt road. The forest swallows it completely now. The cabin's probably collapsed by now, but I'll never go check. Because somewhere out there, in those trees, someone knew exactly where I'd been. And they'd made sure I couldn't leave, at least not right away. And that's the part that still keeps me up some nights. The thought that I only got out because they let me. It was late October, somewhere around 2011, when I decided to take a few days off work and head north into the woods of Montana. I had been working long shifts at a warehouse, and the noise and the people were starting to wear me down. I wanted silence, a place where I could just breathe and not think about anyone or anything. A friend from high school had told me years ago about a small, old cabin his grandfather used to hunt from, something built back in the 1940s and left to rot after the man passed. It wasn't on any map, just a short hike from a logging trail near the edge of Flathead National Forest. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I figured I'd be gone 3 or 4 days at most. The drive took me most of the morning. The roads narrowed as I got deeper into the forest, from highway to gravel, and then just dirt. I had a printed out satellite map in my passenger seat, the kind that looked outdated even when new. I parked my truck off the side of the trail where the forest thickened and started walking. It was colder than I expected, with a light wind that made the trees creak and sway. The ground was soft underfoot, covered in pine needles and damp leaves that muffled most of my steps. After about 40 minutes, I saw it. A small clearing with a collapsed wire fence around the edge and a shape that barely looked like a building anymore. The cabin sat crooked, half buried under fallen branches, its roof sagging inward. The wood was gray and dry, the windows covered with boards that looked like they had been nailed there decades ago. A metal chimney stuck out the top, rusted all the way down. The door was still on its hinges, though leaning, and there were old tire tracks in the mud that had long hardened. I felt uneasy right away. It wasn't fear, not exactly, just that kind of heaviness that comes when you realize a place has been forgotten by time. I walked around it first. There was an old hand pump well out back, a half-collapsed outhouse, and what looked like the remains of a shed. Moss grew up the sides of the walls and animal tracks circled the place. Deer, raccoon, maybe even bear. I checked the porch before stepping on it. The wood creaked under my boots, but it held. Inside smelled like old dirt and would smoke. The main room was small, maybe 15 feet wide. There was a stone fireplace against one wall, a rusty iron stove in the corner, and a wooden table with one leg missing. Dust was everywhere. I could see old tin cans on a shelf, a few broken glass jars, and a pile of rotted clothes in the corner. The air was stale and cold. I set my pack down and started clearing a spot for my sleeping bag. There was something strange about how quiet it was. Even the forest outside didn't sound right. Normally you'd hear wind, birds, insects, but here, everything was still. I stepped outside for a bit to chop some branches for firewood, and even then, the sound of my axe hitting would echoed more than it should have. I figured maybe it was just the shape of the valley. By dusk, I had a small fire going in the old fireplace. The light flickered against the walls, showing stains and old carvings in the wood. Someone had scratched initials into the beams, along with dates: 1954, 1971, 1983. I noticed deep scratches near the door frame, too. At first I thought it was just old wear, but the more I looked, the more they seemed like claw marks, wide and uneven, as if something large had tried to push through. I didn't dwell on it too long. That first night I didn't sleep much. I lay there in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling beams while the fire crackled low. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like footsteps outside. Slow, steady, moving along the porch. Then silence. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, but it was too deliberate. I could hear the weight shift on the boards. I didn't move, just listened. After a minute or two, it stopped. When morning came, I checked outside. There were tracks near the porch steps. Human tracks, bare feet. The prints were faint but clear enough in the damp soil. They led from the edge of the clearing to the cabin and then back into the trees. I stood there for a while, staring at them, feeling my stomach twist. It was freezing cold at night. No one would be barefoot out here. I packed my gear, ready to leave, but something about it made me pause. The forest looked peaceful again. Sunlight came through the trees, steam rose off the damp ground, and part of me felt foolish. Maybe they weren't human tracks. Maybe I was just tired. I decided to stay one more night, but I made sure to move my sleeping spot closer to the fire and kept my hatchet within reach. That afternoon, I explored the area around the cabin. A few hundred yards away, I found what looked like an old hunting blind made of logs and brush. Inside were broken beer bottles, a rusted lantern, and a pair of boots that had sunk into the dirt. I couldn't help but feel watched the entire time. Every now and then, I caught movement between the trees, just enough to make my heart pick up. But every time I turned my head, there was nothing. When I came back to the cabin, the door was open. I was sure I'd closed it that morning. The latch was broken, so it could have just been the wind, but the air inside felt different, colder, heavier. My pack had been moved, not emptied, just shifted a few feet closer to the door. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want the light to give away my position. I sat against the wall with my flashlight off, just listening. For hours, there was nothing but my breathing. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, around the cabin. They stopped at the window nearest me. I could hear something brushing against the boards. Then the handle of the door creaked. It wasn't being pulled, more like tested, moved slightly, and then stopped. I waited for what felt like an hour before it finally went silent again. At dawn, I opened the door and scanned the clearing. More footprints. Bare feet again, but this time there were more of them. Maybe 2 or 3 sets, smaller than before. They circled the cabin, crossed over each other, and disappeared into the woods. That was it for me. I wasn't going to stay another night. I packed up everything and started hiking back toward my truck. I remember feeling watched the entire way, even when I knew there was no sound behind me. My back felt tight, my hands sweating despite the cold. When I reached the logging trail, I looked back once more. Between the trees, maybe 50 yards away, there was a figure standing there. I couldn't see the face, just the outline of a man, thin, tall, unmoving. He didn't follow me, but he also didn't turn away. I didn't look again. When I got to my truck, the driver's side door was open. I was sure I had locked it when I left. My glove compartment was open, too, papers scattered across the seat. Nothing stolen, just disturbed. I slammed the door shut and drove until I hit the main road, not looking in the mirrors more than I had to. That night, I checked into a cheap motel outside Kalispell. I sat there on the edge of the bed, dirty and exhausted, trying to convince myself I hadn't just walked into someone's territory. The cabin wasn't haunted. It wasn't cursed. It was just a place people had forgotten, a place where maybe some others hadn't left. A week later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online for anything about that area. Old hunting forums, abandoned property listings, anything. I found a small news piece from 1998 about 2 missing squatters found dead in the woods near Flathead. They had been living in a cabin that burned down years later. Cause of death: exposure. It didn't say which cabin. That's when I realized the one I found must have been rebuilt or just survived the fire somehow. Maybe others had come through since then, drifters, hermits, or people with nowhere else to go. Whoever they were, they weren't gone. They were still out there, moving barefoot through the trees at night, circling any light they saw. I never went back. I can still picture those footprints in the mud, the sound of slow steps on the porch, and that shape in the trees that didn't move. Every now and then, when I drive north on those empty roads and see the dark outline of the forest in my headlights, I think about how quiet it was in that clearing, too quiet, and how some places aren't meant to be found again. I rented a small cabin near Taos, New Mexico in October 2017. I'd been working as a freelance photographer for about a year and needed a quiet place to finish editing a batch of outdoor shots for a client. The cabin sat about 30 miles north of town, right at the edge of the Carson National Forest. It wasn't fancy, just a single-room structure with a kitchenette, a small wood stove, a creaky bed, and a porch that looked out over the pine-covered hills. When I first got there, it felt peaceful. The air was cool and dry, and the days were short enough that the sunsets spilled long red shadows across the trees. There was no cell service, no internet, just a small radio that picked up a few stations from Santa Fe. I liked the quiet. I told myself I'd stay for 2 weeks. The first few days were normal. I woke up early, went hiking with my camera, and came back around dusk to edit my photos. I kept my food simple: instant coffee, canned soup, and sandwiches. I'd sit by the stove, sometimes reading or writing in my notebook, and by 10 p.m., I'd be asleep. But around the 5th night, something felt different. I'd been sitting on the porch after dark, listening to the wind move through the trees. The forest was thick and black, and the moon was only half visible through thin clouds. I remember hearing a sound. It wasn't loud, just a sort of low, rough shuffle. I thought it was maybe a deer or something moving through the brush, but the sound seemed slow, almost dragging. I brushed it off and went inside. The next morning, I found tracks behind the cabin. At first glance, they looked like coyote prints, but they were spaced oddly, and a few seemed to show what looked like a heel. I crouched down, ran my fingers over them, and felt this weird chill run through me. The dirt was damp from the night air, and I could see where something heavy had pressed down near the base of the back steps. I took a photo of the prints out of habit, then forgot about it by lunchtime. That night, I went to bed early. The temperature had dropped, and the wood stove didn't do much to hold off the cold. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a scratching noise. It wasn't inside. It came from somewhere near the outer wall. A faint scraping, then silence. Then it started again, slower, like something was dragging its nails or claws across the siding. My first thought was raccoon, but it sounded heavier than that. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to stop. After a few minutes, I heard a dull thump, like something bumping the porch railing. Then silence again. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, the air felt heavy. I stepped outside and checked the porch. There were smudges on the wooden railing, dark marks that looked like dirt or maybe dried mud. I walked around the side of the cabin and found more prints in the soil, deeper this time. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a wounded coyote, something sick and confused that had wandered too close. That afternoon, I went hiking again, hoping to shake the feeling. I followed a trail uphill until I could see the valley spread out below me, the trees thick and endless. Somewhere out there, a single hawk circled. Everything looked calm, but I couldn't stop thinking about those sounds. When I got back to the cabin that evening, I decided to move my camera equipment inside instead of leaving it in the car. By the 7th night, I was barely sleeping. Every little sound set me on edge. The forest that had seemed calm now felt alive in a way that wasn't comforting. Even during the day, I'd find small things out of place. Rocks piled near the porch steps, a faint smell, almost like wet fur or something dead. I stopped sitting outside at night. Then came the night that burned itself into my memory. It was windy and cold. The stove had gone out while I slept, and I woke up shivering. I looked at my watch. It was just after 3 a.m. The cabin was pitch black, except for a sliver of moonlight leaking through the window. I lay there for a moment, listening. There it was again, the same dragging shuffle I'd heard days earlier. It came from the back of the cabin, slow and uneven. I could hear each step pressing into the dirt. Then it stopped. For a few seconds, everything was quiet. I could almost hear my own heartbeat. Then, from the porch, a creak, the sound of weight shifting on wood. I sat up, trying not to make any noise. My camera tripod was near the window, and I reached for it, not sure why. Maybe just wanting something solid in my hands. The floorboards felt cold under my bare feet. Then I saw a shadow move across the window. Not fast, just this slow, hunched shape gliding past the edge of the glass. The figure was too tall to be a coyote or a dog, and its movement was off, like something not used to walking upright. I froze. My throat felt dry. The shape moved again, closer to the door this time. The knob rattled just slightly, like someone testing it. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at that door. Maybe a minute, maybe 10. Then came a sound I'll never forget. A kind of low, rasping breath, right outside. Not a growl, not human either. Just this wet, broken exhale that made every hair on my body stand up. I waited until the sound faded, until I was sure whatever it was had gone. When I finally found the courage to step outside at dawn, the air was bitter cold. There were fresh prints in the dirt, long, narrow, almost like footprints but uneven, the weight shifting strangely from toe to heel. They led away from the cabin into the trees and disappeared in the underbrush. I packed up that morning. I didn't even finish my coffee. I loaded my car, locked the cabin door, and drove straight back toward Taos. The forest looked different in daylight. Quiet again, harmless, but every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of movement between the trees, just enough to make my stomach twist. When I got back to town, I stopped at a diner. The waitress asked if I was okay. I must have looked pale, but I just said I hadn't slept much. Later that afternoon, when I was going through my camera files, I found the photo I'd taken of the tracks from that first morning. Looking closer, I realized something that made my hands shake. The prints weren't just from one creature. There were two sets. One was wide, like an animal's paw. The other had toes, long, human-like toes, but the spacing was all wrong. I never went back to that cabin. A few months later, I looked it up online, just out of curiosity. Turns out it had been built on old ranch land that bordered a stretch of forest where, years ago, people had reported strange sightings. Mostly animals walking on two legs, odd screams at night, livestock found torn apart. I didn't believe in that kind of thing. Still don't. But when I think back to that night, the sound of that breathing right outside the door, I get the same feeling I had when I saw those prints. I know what I heard. I know what I saw in that window. Maybe it was an animal, maybe something injured or sick that moved in a way that didn't make sense. Maybe there's an explanation I just haven't found yet. But when people ask me why I never go camping anymore, I tell them the truth. Out there, in that stretch of forest near Taos, something moves like a man but isn't one. Something that knows what doors are, what windows are, and how close it can get before you notice. And if you ever wake up in the middle of the night in a cabin that far out, and you hear the boards creak under something heavy, don't look out the window. Just listen, because if you listen long enough, you'll realize it's listening too. It was late September of 2017 when I decided to take a week off from work and stay at a small cabin in northern Montana. I'd rented it through a local listing site that advertised it as a hunter's rest stop, about 15 miles from the nearest town and surrounded by dense pine woods. I wasn't much of a hunter, but I liked quiet places. I'd been living in Billings for years, working long hours at a repair shop, and I just wanted some days away from the noise, the people, the constant ring of phones and clanking of tools. I packed my old Ford Ranger with enough supplies to last a week: food, water, a sleeping bag, a small generator, and a shotgun that I'd borrowed from a friend just in case of wildlife. The drive up there took around 6 hours. The first 4 were on decent paved roads, but the last 2 turned into gravel and dirt trails that twisted through forests and small hills. I didn't see another car after the last small gas station I passed. The air got colder the higher I went, and by the time I reached the cabin, The sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the dirt clearing. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected. It had one main room with a small kitchenette, a single bed pushed against the wall, and a wood stove in the corner. The wood siding was worn gray, and there were patches on the roof that looked like they'd been repaired with sheet metal. There was no signal, no Wi-Fi, nothing but the constant hum of wind through trees. I didn't mind that. That was kind of the point. The first night was peaceful. I cooked some canned chili on the small propane burner, sat outside for a bit listening to the forest, then went to bed early. It was cold, but the sleeping bag did its job. The silence was thick, almost too thick. I remember lying there for a long time, just listening to my own breathing. The next morning, I woke up early and took a walk down the trail that led deeper into the woods. I found a small creek about a mile out, filled my water container, and followed the sound of the water for a while. Everything seemed calm, untouched, the kind of place where you could forget time existed. I spent most of the day chopping some wood for the stove, fixing up small things around the cabin, and reading a bit. But when evening came, something felt off. It wasn't anything I could see, just a feeling. The woods had gone quiet, quieter than they should have been. No birds, no crickets, just silence and the faint rustling of wind that didn't sound like wind. I tried to ignore it. I cooked dinner, made some coffee, and wrote a few notes in my journal. But as I was sitting near the stove, I thought I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, just a crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze and listened. Came again. Slow, spaced apart, moving around the cabin. I figured it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or an elk. Still, I took the shotgun from where it leaned against the wall and kept it nearby. I didn't go outside though. I just waited, sitting still until the sounds faded away. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, listening for noises. A few times I thought I heard something brushing against the walls, maybe branches in the wind, but it sounded too deliberate. When morning came, I stepped outside and walked a slow circle around the cabin. There were prints in the dirt. They weren't animal tracks. They were boots someone had been walking around. The prints were faint, but they circled the cabin twice before disappearing into the trees. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding. I didn't see anyone, and I didn't hear anything, just the cold morning air. I thought about packing up and leaving, but the idea of driving 6 hours through the mountains didn't feel smart, especially when I didn't know who or what was out there. So I decided to stay another day, maybe 2, but to keep alert. I started locking the door with a heavy chain I found hanging near the wood stove and kept the shotgun loaded beside the bed. That afternoon, I heard a truck somewhere down the trail. It was distant, maybe a mile away, but it didn't sound like it was moving. It idled for a bit, then went silent. I waited to see if it would come closer, but it never did. The woods stayed still again. By sundown, that strange feeling came back, heavier this time, like I was being watched. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind against the window made my nerves jump. When night came, I didn't light the stove. I didn't want the light to show through the windows. I sat in the dark with a flashlight and waited. Hours went by. Around midnight, I heard the first sound, a slow scraping noise near the front porch. Then the crunch of steps again, heavier this time. I held the shotgun tight, breathing through my nose, heart hammering in my chest. The steps stopped right outside the door. I could hear breathing, faint but close, like someone standing inches away from the wood. The door handle rattled softly, then nothing, just silence. I sat there for what felt like forever. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Eventually, I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was waking up to pale morning light. My mouth was dry, my hands stiff from gripping the gun. I checked the door. It hadn't been opened, but the prints outside were clearer this time. Boots again, and this time there were more of them. 2 sets, at least. They'd come from the woods, stopped near the door, and then walked around toward the back before disappearing again. I didn't wait around after that. I packed my things as fast as I could, threw them in the truck, and started driving back toward the main road. The trail was narrow, with branches brushing against both sides of the truck. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. About 5 miles down, I saw something that made me slow down. A red pickup truck parked halfway off the trail. It looked old, maybe from the early 2000s, with mud caked along the sides. The driver's door was open, but nobody was inside. I stopped for a moment, engine idling, staring at it. There were tools and ropes in the back, a fuel can, and what looked like old hunting gear. I didn't see any sign of someone nearby. I didn't get out. I just kept driving. It took me most of the day to get back to the main road, and when I finally saw the small town again, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in days. I stopped at a diner, sat in the corner, and just drank coffee until my hands stopped shaking. I thought about telling someone, but what could I say? I hadn't seen anyone. Just tracks, just sounds. Nothing that could prove anything. I drove straight home after that and didn't tell anyone for a long time. A few weeks later, I looked up that rental listing again out of curiosity. The page was gone. I searched the name of the owner from my old booking receipt, but nothing came up. No record of the property, no contact info, nothing. It was like it had never been listed. Sometimes I still think about those footprints circling the cabin, the breathing at the door, the red truck on the trail. I know what I heard. I know what I saw. Someone was out there that night, maybe watching, maybe waiting for something. I'll never know what their plan was, but I know one thing for sure. If I hadn't locked that chain across the door, I don't think I'd have made it out of that cabin. I still don't understand what pushed me to go there that summer. Maybe it was the need to get away, to be somewhere quiet after months of being stuck in traffic, noise, and crowded rooms. I just turned 31, working as a mechanic in a small town in Kansas, and everything felt repetitive. Every day was the same: oil stains, greasy hands, broken cars, and empty evenings. So when I saw an old listing online for a small cabin for rent in northern Montana, I booked it without thinking twice. The pictures showed a wooden cabin surrounded by thick pine trees, a lake not too far away, and a small porch with a broken chair. It looked peaceful. I packed up my old pickup truck with some tools, a sleeping bag, canned food, a cooler, and a generator just in case. It was mid-July, hot and dry, but I knew the nights would be colder that far north. The drive took almost 2 days. By the time I reached the dirt road leading to the cabin, my back hurt and my hands were stiff from gripping the steering wheel. The road was narrow, uneven, and the trees on both sides leaned inward like they were closing in. My tires kicked up dust and small stones. I didn't see another car for almost an hour. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked smaller than I expected. The roof was rusted at the edges, and the wooden walls were sun-bleached and cracked. The front steps sagged, and the railing looked like it would snap if I leaned on it. But it was quiet. I could hear only the wind moving through the pines and the distant sound of a woodpecker somewhere deep in the forest. The air smelled sharp, like sap, dirt, and something faintly metallic. Inside, it was simple. One room, a small kitchen corner, a bed frame with an old mattress, a table, and a chair. The air was stale, like no one had opened the place in months. I opened the windows, and a wave of pine air came in. I unloaded my truck, cleaned off the table, and lit a small lantern. My phone had no signal, which I expected. I told myself that was the point of this trip, to disconnect. The first night was fine. The crickets outside were loud, and I could hear the faint splash of the lake when the wind picked up. I read an old magazine I found in a drawer, ate canned beans, and went to bed early. But even then, I noticed something strange, a faint smell that didn't belong. It wasn't rot or sewage, more like rusted metal mixed with something sour. I assumed it was the pipes or maybe an old animal that had died under the porch. I decided to check in the morning. The next day, I went exploring. The forest behind the cabin was thick but calm. The ground was soft with pine needles, and sunlight filtered through the branches in narrow lines. About half a mile from the cabin, I found what looked like the remains of another structure. Just a few logs and a metal barrel half buried in the ground. It must have been another cabin long ago. There was an old chain hanging from one of the beams, rusted and stiff. I didn't think much of it then. Back at the cabin, I lifted a few boards near the porch to see if something had died underneath. Nothing, just dry soil and spider webs. The smell was stronger, though. It was coming from inside, from the far corner near the bed. I moved the mattress and found a loose floorboard. It wasn't nailed down, just sitting slightly raised. I pulled it up, and underneath was a small empty space, maybe 2 feet deep. Inside it was an old glass jar filled with what looked like blackened liquid and small, rotted pieces of something I couldn't identify. Smelled awful. I covered it back up and put the board down, deciding it was probably some old storage jar or chemical someone left there decades ago. That night, the smell got worse. I slept lightly, waking up every hour. Once, I thought I heard something moving outside, like slow steps on dry leaves, but it could have been a deer. Around 3 a.m., I sat up because the smell was so strong it made my throat hurt. I grabbed my flashlight, went outside, and walked around the cabin. The forest was still silent. No wind, no bugs, no animals. I noticed faint drag marks near the back wall, thin lines in the dirt, like something had been pulled across it. I followed them for a few feet, but they just disappeared near the trees. In the morning, I tried to ignore it. I made coffee on the portable stove and sat on the porch. But something in the back of my mind felt wrong. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a steady pressure, like being watched. I tried to shake it off by doing small repairs around the cabin. I fixed the loose steps, cleaned the windows, swept the floor. But as the day went on, I couldn't stop noticing small things. Footprints that weren't mine near the path. The smell moving in and out of the room, stronger at certain times. By the third night, I couldn't stand it. I packed my things and decided I'd leave in the morning as soon as the sun came up. I kept the generator running that night so the cabin wouldn't feel so silent. The low hum made it easier to breathe. But around 2 a.m., the generator sputtered and died. I got up with my flashlight to restart it, annoyed more than scared. When I stepped outside, I froze. The drag marks were back, fresh this time, cutting through the dirt toward the trees again. The smell was overwhelming, metallic and rotten, like something wet baking under heat. I followed the marks with my light, my heart pounding. They led to the old half-buried structure I'd found before. The jar came back to my mind. I crouched near the barrel, shining the light around. The ground looked disturbed, darker soil, freshly moved. I used a stick to poke at it, and it sank easily into the dirt. That's when I saw it. A piece of fabric, dark gray and torn, sticking out from the soil. I brushed more dirt aside and saw what looked like a sleeve. My brain caught up slowly. I dropped the stick, stumbled back, and almost fell. It wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was an arm. A human arm, pale and stiff. The skin dried out and the fingernails blackened. I felt my stomach twist. Whoever had been there wasn't buried deep, just covered enough to be hidden. My flashlight beam trembled in my hand. I ran back to the cabin and locked the door. I sat there, sweating, trying to think clearly. There was no phone signal. The nearest town was hours away. I decided I'd leave as soon as daylight came. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound outside made my skin crawl. Around dawn, I loaded everything into the truck, turned the key, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. Once I got to town, I went straight to the sheriff's office. I told them everything, showed them the pictures I took on my phone of the arm and the site. They went up there later that day. When they came back, the officer told me they found the remains of 2 bodies near that old foundation. One had been there for years, maybe decades, the other more recent, less than a year old. They said the cabin had once belonged to a man who went missing 15 years ago, never found. The newer body wasn't identified yet when I left town. I never went back for my deposit or my tools. A few weeks later, I got a call from one of the officers. They said they'd found something buried under the cabin floorboards, sealed in a jar, teeth, small bones, and metal fragments. They thought the place had been used for more than just living. It's been months since then, and I still wake up sometimes thinking I can smell that same sour, metallic scent. I sold my truck and quit my job. I live in an apartment now where I can hear people through the walls, cars on the street, voices in the hallway. Feels safer that way. I learned that the quiet isn't always peace. Sometimes it's just the sound of something waiting to be found. It was early November, the kind of month when the air starts to bite a little and the trees look tired. I had taken a week off from work to get away from everything. My dog, Jasper, was my only company. He was a large, brown mixed breed, loyal but jumpy around new places. I had rented a small cabin deep in the northern woods of Montana, near a quiet lake called Birch Hollow. The cabin wasn't new or fancy. It was small, made of rough logs with a tin roof that clattered in the wind. There was no Wi-Fi, barely any phone signal, and the nearest store was about 40 minutes away down a narrow dirt road. That was exactly what I wanted. The first few days were calm. I spent most of my time chopping wood, walking Jasper around the property, and sitting by the fire at night. The air had that cold smell of pine and damp soil. At night, the forest came alive with the sounds of owls and the cracking of branches far off in the dark. Jasper would perk up sometimes, growl low under his breath, and then settle again when nothing followed. I thought it was just deer or raccoons moving through the brush. By the 4th night, the weather started to change. The wind had picked up, coming in sharp gusts that made the trees groan. Clouds rolled in, heavy and gray, and a light rain started falling before sunset. I had gathered extra firewood and stacked it by the door earlier that day. Jasper had been restless since afternoon, pacing around the porch, sniffing at the air, then whining softly as if something didn't sit right with him. I figured he was just uneasy because of the storm. That night, I was sitting by the fire, reading with the lantern beside me, when Jasper lifted his head suddenly and stared toward the window. His body went stiff, tail low, ears pinned forward. I turned my head slowly, but I didn't see anything outside except the rain sliding down the glass. Still, I felt something, just that quiet sense of being watched, like eyes somewhere out there in the black trees. I shook it off, told myself it was my mind playing tricks because of the wind and the isolation. But Jasper didn't calm down. He stood there, staring toward the window for a long time, his nose twitching, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Later, when I stepped outside to bring in another load of wood, the air was colder. The rain had turned into a mist, floating low across the ground. The woods beyond the cabin looked darker than usual. I could only hear the faint rustle of branches moving. Jasper followed me out but stayed close, not wandering like he usually did. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No crickets, no frogs, just the sound of the wind sliding through the trees. I grabbed the wood quickly and went back inside. Around midnight, Jasper woke me up with a sharp bark. He was standing by the front door, hackles raised, staring through the small window. My heart started pounding hard. I reached for the flashlight and pointed it out the window, but the beam didn't show anything. The rain had stopped, leaving a thin layer of fog drifting between the trees. Then I saw something, just the faint shape of movement at the edge of the clearing. It was far away, maybe near the treeline. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal, but it was there, still and upright. The moment the light hit that spot, it shifted back into the darkness. Jasper started barking louder, snapping his head toward the door. I shut the curtains and sat there in the dark, trying to calm my breathing. I told myself it was probably a hunter, or maybe someone who got lost, but deep down it didn't feel right. No one should have been out there that late, especially in that weather. I didn't sleep much after that. Jasper stayed alert, occasionally growling, then resting his head again, but his body stayed tense the whole time. The next morning, everything looked normal. The sun came out, weak but steady, lighting up the wet forest. I went outside to check the yard and noticed footprints. Fresh ones, not mine, not from Jasper. They were near the edge of the clearing, leading in from the trees and stopping a few feet away from the cabin. They weren't boots either. They looked like worn sneakers, too small to be work boots, too narrow to be hiking shoes. They didn't circle the cabin or go toward the lake, just stopped near the window. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I stood there for a long time, staring at those prints, feeling the cold air sting my skin. Whoever had been there wasn't wandering. They had come straight to the cabin and stopped. I spent the rest of the day uneasy, glancing out the window now and then. Jasper stuck close to me, not even chasing squirrels like he usually did. That night, I decided to keep the lantern off. I sat in the dark, the fire burning low, listening to the wind outside. The forest was quiet again, too quiet. Jasper lay near the door, head up, staring into the dark. Around midnight again, there was a noise, something faint but clear. Not footsteps exactly, but a scraping sound, like someone dragging something lightly across the porch. My throat went dry. Jasper stood up slowly, every muscle in his body tight. I didn't move at first. I just listened. The sound came again, closer this time, like the edge of metal against wood. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it through the side window, quick and sharp. Nothing, just the mist and the faint glint of wet ground. Then I heard it again, this time on the other side of the cabin. Whoever or whatever it was, they were circling slowly. Jasper started barking uncontrollably, his paws scratching at the floorboards. I felt a rush of adrenaline. I ran to the door, slammed the bolt, and stood there, listening to the fading sound of footsteps moving away into the woods. It was impossible to sleep after that. Every sound outside made my nerves jolt. I kept Jasper inside and sat up until dawn. When I finally stepped outside in the morning, I saw marks on the porch, long, uneven scratches along the wooden boards, as if someone had dragged something heavy or sharp across them. There were more footprints too, circling around the cabin this time. They were the same as before, light, narrow, not boots. That day I packed my bags. I didn't even bother to make breakfast. I had come there to be alone, but now all I could think about was getting back to where people were. I loaded the car with what I could fit, tied Jasper's leash, and took one last look at the cabin. The woods looked peaceful again, sunlight falling through the branches, the lake shimmering quietly through the trees. But the silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt watchful, heavy. On my way out, I stopped at the small ranger station down the dirt road. The ranger on duty listened quietly while I explained, his face tightening a little when I mentioned the footprints and the scratches. He said there had been reports over the past few weeks. People camping or staying near the lake had noticed someone wandering around at night, trying to break into empty cabins. They hadn't caught anyone yet. I felt a cold shiver go through me. When I got back to the main road, I looked in the rearview mirror. The trees swayed in the distance, disappearing slowly behind me. Jasper was sitting in the back seat, his head resting on the seat, eyes half open but still alert. I realized then that maybe it wasn't just my imagination all along. Something, or someone, really had been out there watching. Even now, weeks later, I still think about that cabin sometimes. The smell of the wet wood, the sound of the tin roof in the wind, the quiet way the forest felt just before the noises started. I think about how close those footprints had come to the window, how they stopped there like whoever made them had stood watching for a long time. I'll never know who it was or what they wanted, but I know I was lucky to leave when I did. If I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have slept through the sounds again. And maybe, just maybe, those prints would have gone one step farther, right to the door. It had been 6 years since my grandfather passed away, but the memory of his cabin stayed burned into my mind like something I could never wash off. He built that place himself, deep in the woods outside of a small town in northern Montana. It wasn't anything fancy, just a square wooden cabin with a tin roof, a single bedroom, and a shed out back. It stood on the edge of a slope that looked down to a stream where he used to fish every morning. He'd lived alone there for the last 15 years of his life after my grandmother died. My father used to tell me that the cabin changed him, made him quieter, withdrawn. I was only 26 when he died, but I still remember the day I got the call. They said he'd died inside the cabin. Natural causes, they said. He was found sitting in his chair near the window, like he had fallen asleep watching the woods. I never went there when they took his body. My father handled everything. They buried him in the small cemetery near town, and that was that. But lately, something about the place had started creeping into my thoughts again. Maybe it was because my father had passed too, or maybe I just needed to see it for myself. I wanted to understand what kind of life my grandfather lived alone in that cabin all those years. So one Friday afternoon in October, I packed my dog, Rex, a big brown shepherd mix, and drove up there. The road turned to gravel after the town ended. The trees grew thicker, darker, and the path narrowed until branches scraped against the sides of my truck. The sky was low and gray, the kind that made everything feel colder than it was. When I finally saw the cabin, my stomach tightened. It looked smaller than I remembered. The wood had darkened from years of rain, and the windows were clouded with grime. The place looked dead. I parked in the clearing and got out. The air smelled like wet leaves and old dirt. Rex jumped out behind me, sniffing the ground. The front steps creaked when I stepped onto them, and the door stuck halfway before I forced it open. The smell hit me right away. Mold, old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic underneath it all, like rust or blood that had long dried. It was the kind of smell that got stuck in the back of your throat. Inside, everything was still. The wooden floor was warped and uneven, the furniture covered in dust. A table stood near the window, a chair pushed back like someone had just gotten up from it. The wood stove in the corner was half open, ashes scattered around it. There were no signs of life, but also no signs of anyone ever cleaning up after he died. Felt wrong, like time had stopped inside this place the day he was found. I walked around slowly, my boots crunching bits of broken glass near the counter. There were old tools, a rusted lantern, and a few glass jars with something cloudy inside. I remembered he used to pickle vegetables, though the jars now looked like they were filled with mud. Rex paced near the door, sniffing, his tail stiff. The back room was his bedroom. The bed was neatly made, which was odd because my father told me the sheriff found him sitting in his chair in the main room. There were folded clothes on a chair, a pair of boots on the floor, and a small wooden box on the nightstand. I opened it. Inside were a few photographs, yellowed and curled. One was of me as a kid, sitting on his lap on that same porch outside. He looked happy in it. I stared at the photo for a while before setting it down. That's when I noticed something off. There was a trapdoor in the corner of the bedroom floor. I didn't remember that being there. It was square with a small metal handle half covered by an old rug. I lifted it, and the smell that came out hit me like a punch to the face. Rotting, damp, like something had died a long time ago. Rex growled, backing up, ears stiff. I shined my flashlight down. The beam showed wooden steps leading into a small space below the floor. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I climbed down slowly, holding the flashlight in one hand. The basement wasn't much, just dirt walls and a low ceiling with wooden beams. The air was heavy and cold. There were shelves along one wall, filled with old canned food and jars, some cracked or broken. In the far corner, there was something covered with a tarp. It was large, maybe the size of a person. My throat tightened. The tarp was thick with dust, edges crusted with dirt. I pulled the edge of it back, and the smell grew worse. I gagged. Underneath was a body, not fresh. The clothes were old and stiff, skin shrunken, almost mummified by the dry, cold air. The shirt was flannel, same kind my grandfather always wore. But the face, what was left of it, wasn't just age. There was something else. His skull looked like it had been hit, cracked near the temple. My flashlight shook in my hand. My chest felt tight, and for a moment I couldn't move. My grandfather had been buried. I went to his funeral. I saw the coffin go into the ground. But this was him. The same ring he used to wear on his right hand with the black stone. The same boots with the worn toe. My mind started spinning. If he was here, then who the hell did they bury? I stumbled back and hit the wall. The flashlight slipped from my hand, rolling on the dirt, the beam spinning wildly. Rex was barking upstairs, loud and panicked. My head was spinning, but somehow I got myself up the stairs, slamming the trapdoor shut. I stood there for a while, breathing hard, trying to understand what I'd seen. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grab my phone. I had no service out there anyway. I couldn't stay in that cabin another second. I grabbed my bag, called Rex, and walked out. The air outside felt sharp, clean, but I could still smell that rot in my nose. I locked the door behind me out of instinct, even though it didn't make sense. I drove down the trail fast, tires sliding on the gravel, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles hurt. When I finally reached town, I went straight to the small police office. They didn't believe me at first, not until I told them about the ring and the flannel and where to look. They sent 2 deputies up there the next morning. I didn't go back. I waited in town, pacing outside the diner with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. When they came back, they didn't say much in front of people, but one of them nodded at me. They had found something under the floor. Later, the sheriff called me into his office. He said it was definitely my grandfather's body. The medical examiner confirmed it. The remains in the grave, they weren't his. They belonged to someone else, maybe another man around the same age, never identified. He said the death was ruled a homicide, blunt force trauma. But the part that stayed with me was this: there were no signs anyone else had lived in that cabin after him. No footprints, no records of visitors, nothing. The door had been locked from the inside when they found him years ago. The mystery stayed open. They never figured out who the body in the grave was or how it was switched. The cabin was torn down a year later, the land sold. But even now, sometimes when I close my eyes, I can see that trapdoor, smell that heavy air, and I think about the years my grandfather spent alone out there, surrounded by miles of forest. I wonder if someone came for him in the night, or if he let them in himself. I've kept the photo from his nightstand, him and me on the porch, both smiling. But every time I look at it now, I notice how dark the woods look behind us, how his eyes aren't looking at the camera but somewhere past it, into the trees. And every time I see it, I can't help but wonder if he already knew something was waiting out there, long before anyone else did. It was late September of 2012 when I took a seasonal job as a park ranger in a remote area of northern Montana. I was 29 at the time, single, and looking for something quiet after years of working in the city. I had always liked the outdoors, but this job was different. The area I was assigned to, Flat Ridge National Reserve, wasn't one of those tourist-heavy places. It stretched for miles with thick pine forests, small lakes, and rough terrain that barely anyone visited. The nearest town was about 50 miles away, and there was only one main dirt road leading in. They put me in a small ranger cabin about 3 miles off that main road, deep in the woods. It was an old wooden structure, built sometime in the 1960s, sitting near a small creek that wound through the trees. It had no electricity, just a gas lantern, a wood stove, and an old shortwave radio for contact with the ranger station. The first few days there were peaceful. I'd wake up early, check the trails, look for any fallen trees or broken signs, note animal tracks, and log the weather conditions. Most of the time, I didn't see a single person. By the end of my first week, I started to notice how silent the forest was after sunset. The sound of the creek faded behind the trees, and even the wind seemed to disappear. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of stillness that made you aware of your own breathing. The nights were long, and I'd often sit by the lantern, reading through the old ranger logs stacked on a shelf. Most of them were boring reports, bear sightings, weather notes, equipment lists, but some mentioned odd things. Unclaimed fires in the woods, missing hikers that were never found, distant gunshots that no one could trace. I didn't think much of it at first. One evening, around the 10th day, I went out to collect firewood before it got dark. The sky was gray, heavy with low clouds, and the air smelled like rain. I walked down toward the creek, carrying my hatchet. The forest felt thicker than usual. The trees were so close together that barely any light got through, and the moss-covered ground muffled my footsteps. After about 15 minutes, I found a dead pine and started chopping off small branches. That's when I heard something from the ridge across the creek. A single sharp crack. It wasn't thunder. It sounded more like wood snapping under heavy weight. I stopped swinging the hatchet and stood still. The sound didn't repeat, but I could feel something was off. The forest had gone completely quiet again. No birds, no rustle of wind, nothing. I finished gathering the wood quickly and went back to the cabin. The rain started soon after, tapping lightly against the metal roof. That night, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I sat by the stove, watching the flames flicker against the log walls. Around 10 p.m., I heard another sound, faint but clear, something moving outside. Not close to the door, but around the tree line. It wasn't fast or loud, just slow, crunching footsteps through wet leaves. I froze, staring at the door. I knew the cabin had no locks, just a simple wooden latch. I waited, holding my breath, but the footsteps stopped after a minute. I stayed awake most of the night, listening. The rain grew heavier, and every sound made my chest tighten. When daylight finally came, I checked outside. The ground was covered in wet leaves, and I could see faint prints leading around the cabin toward the creek. They weren't animal prints, they looked like boot marks, but uneven, like someone dragging one foot. I followed them a little way, but they faded near the water. I reported it to the station through the radio. The static-filled voice on the other end told me it was probably a hiker passing through, maybe lost. I didn't argue, but deep down I knew it wasn't just that. Over the next few days, I started noticing small changes. The storage shed behind the cabin, which I always kept shut, had its door slightly open one morning. My lantern, which I left on the table, was lying on the floor when I woke up. I tried to convince myself it was my own carelessness, but I knew I hadn't left it like that. The woods felt heavier each day, like they were watching me. Then came the night that made me want to leave for good. It was raining again, harder than before, with lightning flashing through the trees. The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls, and the creek outside had turned into a loud rush of water. Around midnight, I was sitting on the cot, trying to read, when I heard it. Footsteps again. Closer this time. They came from behind the cabin, crunching slowly on the soaked ground. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped right outside the wall, just a few feet from where I sat. For several minutes, there was nothing but the sound of rain. Then something scraped along the wooden wall, a slow dragging sound like metal against wood. I could feel the vibration through the floorboards. I grabbed the hatchet I kept beside the stove and held it tight. The sound moved toward the window, and I could hear heavy breathing, steady and rough, not an animal's. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The breathing stopped, and after what felt like an hour, I heard the steps fade away toward the trees. When morning came, I checked outside. The ground was muddy from the storm, and sure enough, there were deep footprints leading away from the cabin. The strange thing was, they weren't in a normal walking pattern. One foot dragged behind, leaving a long line in the mud. I followed them for about 100 feet until they disappeared into the creek again. That was the last night I stayed there. I packed what I could and left a note for the next ranger, saying there might be trespassers in the area. I drove to the station and told my supervisor what happened. He didn't seem surprised. He said sometimes poachers or drifters came through and hid out near the old logging areas. He promised they'd check the place, but when I asked later if they found anything, he just said the trail washed out and they couldn't follow it. 2 weeks later, after I'd transferred to another site, I got a call from one of the senior rangers. He said they went back to Flat Ridge to close the cabin for winter. Inside, they found the back wall scratched up from the outside. Long, uneven marks like someone had been clawing or dragging something sharp along it. They also found a pair of old mud-caked boots lying by the creek, one of them torn at the heel. No one claimed them, and no one knew how long they'd been there. I still think about that cabin sometimes, especially when it rains. I can still picture the small wooden room, the flickering lantern light, and that silent forest pressing against the walls. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I know it wasn't some lost hiker. Whoever it was, they knew I was there. They stood just a few feet away in the dark, waiting, listening. And for all I know, they might still be wandering those woods, dragging one foot through the mud, following the sound of the rain. It was early November of 2016 when I decided to drive up to the cabin my uncle used to own in northern Montana. The place had been sitting empty for years, but after I inherited it, I figured I should check on it before winter came. I was 32 at the time, working construction jobs on and off, and I'd been meaning to take a break from everything. The cabin was remote, about 20 miles off the nearest paved road, surrounded by thick pine woods and a small frozen creek running behind it. I thought it would be quiet, peaceful. The drive took nearly 9 hours. By the time I reached the dirt trail that led up to the cabin, the sun was setting, turning the trees black against an orange sky. The road was rough, with ice patches and fallen branches everywhere. My truck slid a few times, and I had to get out to move a log blocking the way. The air was freezing, sharp enough to sting my face when I stepped out. By the time I pulled up to the clearing where the cabin sat, darkness had swallowed the forest completely. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered. The paint on the walls had peeled off in long strips, and the porch roof had a slight sag. The windows were covered in dirt and pine needles. I turned off the engine and sat there for a minute, listening. There was no sound except the faint ticking of my truck cooling down. No wind, no birds, just quiet. Inside, it smelled old, like dust, cold wood, and something faintly metallic. I used my flashlight to look around. Everything was still there. The table, the wood stove, a few chairs, and a cot in the corner covered in an old blanket. The last time I'd been here was maybe 15 years ago, when my uncle was still alive. He'd used it for hunting trips. I unpacked my gear and started a fire in the stove. The wood crackled, and the light flickered across the room. The warmth felt good after that long drive. I cooked a can of soup on a small camping burner, ate quietly, and tried not to think about how far I was from anyone. The nearest town was at least an hour away, and cell service didn't reach this deep into the forest. When I stepped outside later to take a piss, I noticed something strange. There were boot prints in the dirt near the side of the cabin, fresh ones. They were clear and deep, the kind made by heavy boots, leading from the tree-line to the cabin wall. I looked around with my flashlight, but the beam just disappeared into the trees. It was pitch black beyond a few feet. I tried not to overthink it. Maybe they were old, maybe a hunter passed by earlier in the week. Still, it made me uneasy. I went back inside, bolted the door, and sat for a while listening to the fire. The wind started picking up around midnight. It howled through the cracks in the walls, and the branches outside scraped against the roof. Couldn't sleep. The kind of silence between gusts was so heavy it made me feel like someone was standing just outside, waiting for the noise to stop. Sometime after 1, I heard something, a single, sharp knock on the back wall of the cabin. Then nothing. I froze. The fire had burned low, and the only light came from the last few glowing embers. My dog, Daisy, who I'd brought with me, lifted her head and growled low. Her fur stood up, and she stared toward the door. Another knock came, slower this time, more deliberate. Then the sound of footsteps circling the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding. I didn't move for a long time, just listened. The steps crunched on the frosted ground, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. Then silence again. I reached for my flashlight and quietly checked the windows. I didn't see anything outside, just the faint shape of trees swaying. I stayed awake the rest of the night, barely breathing, waiting for another sound. When morning came, I went outside. The cold hit hard, biting into my fingers even through gloves. The ground was frozen solid. I walked around the cabin and saw the prints again. More of them now. They weren't mine. They were bigger, spaced farther apart. Whoever made them had walked all around the cabin, stopping at each window. It bothered me enough that I almost left right then, but I told myself it was probably just someone passing through. Maybe a hunter, maybe some hiker who got turned around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched. That day, I went down to the creek to clear my head. The ice was thin, cracking when I stepped near the edge. The sound echoed faintly across the woods. The air smelled of pine and smoke from the fire I'd left smoldering in the stove. I tried to enjoy the quiet, but it didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt heavy, like something was holding its breath. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something small that made my stomach drop. The latch on the back window was unhooked. I was sure I'd locked it the night before. I checked inside, every corner, every drawer, but nothing looked touched. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about the prints, the knocks, the unlocked window. I stayed one more night, though I barely slept. Every sound made my pulse race. The wind, the creaking wood, even Daisy shifting on the floor. I lay there staring at the ceiling until the first light of dawn finally came through the window. The next morning, I packed up everything fast. I was ready to leave that place behind. I went out to load the truck and stopped dead. There were new footprints again, not just one set this time, but two. One pair of heavy boots, same as before, and another smaller pair. They led from the woods right up to the truck, then around to the cabin's front steps. I followed them with my eyes until they disappeared near the porch. Then I saw something that made my throat tighten. The door was slightly open. I was certain I'd locked it before stepping out. I didn't go inside right away. I grabbed the tire iron from the truck and stood there trying to listen. Nothing. I slowly pushed the door open with my foot. The air inside was still. The fire had gone out. Everything looked the same except for one thing. The blanket on the cot was gone. It wasn't on the bed or the floor. It had just vanished. I backed out, heart hammering, grabbed Daisy's leash, and got in the truck. As I pulled out of the clearing, I saw movement near the edge of the woods. Just a flicker of someone stepping back into the trees. I couldn't make out their face. I didn't stop. I drove fast, too fast for that road, the truck bouncing and sliding over ruts. I didn't look back until I hit the highway. When I finally got home that night, I couldn't shake what I'd seen. The footprints, the window, the open door. I thought maybe it was some drifter or someone living out there in the woods. People disappear up in those parts all the time. A week later, I called the sheriff's office in the nearest county just to report it, in case something worse happened later. The deputy said they'd check it out. 2 days after that, he called me back. They found the cabin like I described, door open, ashes in the stove, cans in the trash. But they also found something else a mile down the creek. A small campsite, torn up and covered in frost. There were 2 sleeping bags and a half-buried tarp. Underneath it, they found a pile of old clothes, a hunting knife, and a blanket, the same one that had gone missing from the cot. They told me not to go back out there alone, said someone might have been squatting in the woods, living off abandoned cabins. Probably still was. I never went back. I sold the land the next spring. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed one more night, if I'd gone outside when I heard those footsteps, or if I'd opened the door faster that morning. Now, every time I hear branches scrape against the side of my house during winter, I still remember that cabin. The empty woods, the sound of slow footsteps circling in the dark, and the feeling that someone was just waiting for me to fall asleep. It had been raining since morning, the kind of slow, endless rain that never really storms but never stops either. The forest smelled heavy with wet pine and soil, and every branch drooped under the weight of water. I was alone out there, soaked through my jacket, trying to finish what I started 2 days ago. A small cabin I had been building on a clearing about a mile off an old dirt road. My name's Daniel, 32, and I wasn't building that place for fun or some hobby. I needed a place away from everything. From people, from noise, from everything that reminded me of the city. It was mid-October 1997, just cool enough that you could see your breath in the early mornings. I had already bought the land a few months back, about 6 acres surrounded by thick woods on all sides. The nearest town was 20 minutes away, and I liked that distance. I'd been working on the cabin alone. No contractors, no help, just me, a few tools, and a lot of patience. The rain had made things worse, turning the dirt around the site into thick mud. Every step made a deep sucking sound when I tried to move lumber or tools. The sawdust clumped up into wet mush, and the half-built walls of the cabin dripped with rainwater. The cabin wasn't much to look at yet. 4 walls halfway done, a roof frame covered with a blue tarp that fluttered in the wind. Inside, it was just a floor made of rough planks that creaked under my boots. I had brought a small propane heater to keep myself warm while I worked, but with the rain and damp air, it didn't do much. I remember my hands trembling slightly as I tried to hammer a few nails into place. My gloves were soaked, and the cold metal felt like it was biting through them. By evening, the rain got heavier, the kind that makes a curtain of water where you can't see beyond 10 feet. My pickup truck was parked near the dirt path, its windshield fogged up, the bed filled with scraps of wood and old tools. I thought about leaving for the night, heading back to the cheap motel I was staying in. But something in me didn't want to stop. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself I could do this. So I decided to stay and try to make some progress. The light started to fade early under those thick clouds. By 6, it was already dim, and the rain sounded louder in the dark. I set up a small camping lantern on a sawhorse and started cutting the last few boards I had left. The sound of the saw echoed strangely through the woods. Every time I stopped cutting, I could hear the soft hiss of rain and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere deep in the trees. That sound, the random cracks and rustles, always made me uneasy. It wasn't that I thought something was out there. It was just the kind of noise that gets under your skin when you're alone in the middle of nowhere. At some point, I realized I hadn't eaten all day. I went to my truck and grabbed a sandwich and a thermos of coffee I had packed earlier. I sat on the tailgate, rain dripping off the brim of my hat, the sandwich cold and soggy in my hands. The forest around me was dark now, just the faint outlines of wet trees and fog floating near the ground. Every once in a while, the wind would pick up, and the tarp covering the cabin would flap so loudly it made my stomach tighten. When I went back to the cabin, the lantern flickered. I figured the batteries were dying, so I pulled another set from my toolbox. As I was changing them, I heard a dull thud from somewhere in the dark. It wasn't thunder, it was something heavier, closer, like a log being dropped or maybe something stepping onto wet boards. I froze, listening hard. The rain made it difficult to hear clearly, but there was definitely something. A faint crunching sound, slow, irregular. I tried to ignore it at first. Probably a branch falling, or maybe a deer wandering near the clearing. I kept telling myself that, but my hands were shaking slightly as I picked up my hammer. I kept working anyway, forcing the sound of nails and wood to drown out everything else. But the noise came again, this time closer, maybe 10 or 15 feet from the cabin wall. It wasn't steady. It came in bursts. Crunch, pause, then another crunch. I stopped hammering again. The only thing I could hear was rain sliding down the tarp and dripping onto the mud below. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the mist but didn't show much, just trunks and dripping leaves. The light reflected off something wet on the ground. Maybe a puddle, maybe something else, but I couldn't tell. My pulse was beating in my ears. I didn't move for at least a full minute, just listening, trying to separate every sound. Eventually, the noise stopped. I went back inside, but I couldn't shake that feeling. The one that tells you someone's nearby even when you can't see them. I locked my toolbox, packed away the saw, and tried to calm myself. I had brought a sleeping bag and a small mat for nights like this when I wanted to stay longer, so I spread them out in the corner, near the heater. The rain had softened a bit by then, just steady tapping on the tarp and wood. It was around midnight when I woke up again. The heater had gone out, and the lantern had dimmed to a faint yellow glow. The rain was still there, but softer now. I could hear the trees creaking under the wind. Then came another sound, something brushing against the outer wall. It was faint, but I could hear it sliding slowly across the wood, like a hand or maybe a branch being dragged along the wall. My body went tense. I didn't move, didn't breathe for a moment. Then the sound stopped. I slowly reached for the flashlight again. My fingers were stiff from the cold. I stood up quietly, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it could be heard outside. I pointed the light toward the wall and saw nothing but damp boards and drops of water slipping down the surface. I stepped toward the window opening. There was no glass yet, just an empty frame. The beam from my flashlight swept over the clearing. For a second, I thought I saw movement near the treeline. A shadow, maybe, something that didn't look like a tree. I blinked, and it was gone. I stood there for a long time, staring into the dark, but the forest didn't move again. After a few minutes, I went back inside, but I couldn't sleep. I sat on the floor, hugging my knees, listening to every small sound. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me down, and I fell asleep just before dawn. When I woke up, the rain had finally stopped. A gray light filled the clearing. The air was cold and heavy, and the ground outside was a swamp of mud and puddles. I stepped out, stretching my sore legs, and looked around. That's when I saw it. Near the side of the cabin, in the mud, were footprints. Not boot prints, not animal tracks. They looked like barefoot human prints, deep and smeared from the rain. There were at least 4 or 5 of them, all leading toward the edge of the clearing and then disappearing into the woods. I just stood there staring at them for a long time, my throat tight, my chest heavy. The prints were fresh enough that rain hadn't washed them away completely. I didn't know what to think. Someone had been there, maybe watching, maybe passing by. But barefoot, in the cold, in the middle of nowhere? I followed them to the edge of the trees, but they vanished once the ground turned to grass and leaves. I couldn't tell where they led. That morning, I packed up everything I could fit into the truck and left. I told myself I'd come back when the weather cleared, when I could finish the cabin in daylight. But I never did. A month later, when I finally gathered the nerve to drive back out there, the clearing was empty. The tarp was gone. The tools I'd left behind were rusted, and the cabin frame had partly collapsed under the rain and wind. The footprints were long gone, but I couldn't forget them. I sold the land a year later, never told the buyer why. To this day, every time it rains at night, that sound, that slow crunching in the dark, still plays in my head, and I still wonder who or what was out there that night walking barefoot in the rain. It was late autumn of 2017 when I decided to take a few weeks off work and stay at my uncle's old farm cabin in rural Nebraska. He had passed away a few years earlier, and the property had been left mostly untouched. The fields were overgrown, the barn roof had partially caved in, and the cabin itself sat at the edge of a large, dry cornfield that hadn't been harvested in years. I wanted the quiet. The city noise had been getting to me, and I thought a few weeks of solitude would help clear my head. The drive there took most of the day. The closer I got, the fewer houses I saw. The last hour was nothing but empty dirt roads, dead trees, and distant fields. By the time I arrived, the sun was starting to drop behind the hills, leaving long shadows that made the cabin look even more isolated. It wasn't big, just one floor, a small porch, and a shed behind it. The wood was cracked from years of rain and heat. The windows were covered with thick dust, and I could tell no one had been inside for a long time. Inside, the cabin smelled like stale air and old wood. There were cobwebs in the corners, a few old cans still on the shelves, and a single chair by the window. The floor creaked with every step. I unpacked my things, just a duffel bag, some canned food, and a sleeping bag. I planned to use the generator in the shed for power, but when I checked it, it wouldn't start. I figured I could manage with just a flashlight and a few candles for a few days. That first night, I sat outside on the porch with a cup of instant coffee, watching the fields. The silence was heavy. You don't realize how quiet real countryside is until you sit in it. No cars, no voices, just the wind moving through the dead stalks of corn. The stars were bright, and for a while it felt peaceful. But that peace didn't last long. Around midnight, I heard something, soft at first, like footsteps crunching on the gravel road that ran past the cabin. I froze. The sound stopped for a second, then continued, slower this time. I stood up, trying to look through the dark, but my flashlight barely reached beyond the edge of the porch. The sound moved again, this time circling behind the cabin. I held my breath and waited. After a minute, everything went quiet again. I told myself it was probably an animal. Out here, coyotes and raccoons were common. Still, I locked the door before I went to sleep. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check. The soil behind the place was soft from a recent rain, and there were footprints, bare ones. Not animal tracks, bare human feet. They went around the back of the cabin and then off toward the field. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. The nearest house was miles away. There was no reason for anyone to be walking barefoot out here. I followed the prints a short way until they disappeared into the thick brush near the fence line. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. I went about cleaning the cabin, fixing up the small sink and clearing out dust, but I kept glancing toward the windows. The cornfield looked dead and flat, but sometimes I thought I saw something move. A shadow, maybe just the wind bending a stalk. That night, I tried to sleep but woke up several times to faint noises outside. A dull tapping against the wall, a rustling near the shed. Once, I swore I heard breathing near the porch steps. Each time I got up, shined the flashlight through the window, and saw nothing. By the third day, I was on edge. I barely slept, and every sound made my heart race. I told myself I'd leave the next morning. The quiet no longer felt peaceful. It felt wrong, heavy, like the land itself was hiding something. Before bed, I barricaded the door with the chair and a few boxes. I kept the flashlight and a small hatchet I found in the shed beside me. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound that made my stomach twist. The doorknob was turning slowly back and forth. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The sound stopped, and then the floorboards on the porch creaked, one after another, as if someone was walking across them. I turned off the flashlight and just listened. The steps stopped right by the door. Then came a scraping sound, like nails or fingers, dragging down the wood beside the window. My skin went cold. I wanted to move, to grab the hatchet, but fear pinned me down. After what felt like forever, the noise stopped. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the handle of that hatchet so tight my hand hurt. When morning came, I forced myself to open the door. The first thing I noticed was a set of prints on the porch, bare feet again, but this time they were covered in dried mud. The trail went off toward the field, same direction as before. I followed them a few yards until they faded into the dirt. That's when I saw something farther out. A small, tattered piece of fabric caught on the old wire fence. It looked like part of a shirt. I walked closer, my stomach tight, and noticed the fence had been bent inward, like someone had climbed over it recently. Beyond it, the field stretched for miles. The corn was waist-high and dry, rustling faintly in the wind. I didn't go any farther. I turned around and went back to the cabin, packed my things, and decided to leave that morning. But as I was loading my bag into the truck, I noticed something I hadn't before. On the far side of the shed, half hidden by weeds, was an old, collapsed cellar door. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The wood was gray and soft with rot. I don't know why, but I pulled at it. It gave way easily, revealing a narrow set of stairs leading into the dark. The smell that came out was strong, like damp earth and something else, something sour. I went down a few steps and shined my flashlight inside. The beam caught old tools, some rusted cans, and then something that made my throat tighten. Against the far wall was a pile of clothes, shirts, pants, even a pair of shoes, all filthy and covered in dirt. The pile was too big for just one person's things. There had to be a dozen sets there. I backed out quickly, my heart pounding. That was enough. I didn't need to see more. I shut the cellar door, got in the truck, and left. As I drove down the dirt road, I looked back once. The cabin looked small, almost disappearing into the dry corn around it. I never told anyone what I saw. A few months later, I read online that someone had bought the property to clear it for a new farmhouse. The article mentioned they found several animal bones and what looked like personal belongings buried near the cellar, but nothing more was said. No investigation, no follow-up story. I still think about it sometimes, those bare footprints, the sound of someone walking on the porch, and that pile of clothes under the cabin. Whoever had been out there wasn't just passing through. They had been living there, hiding in those fields long before I came. The idea that I had slept only a few feet above where they might have been staying still keeps me awake some nights. The cabin's probably gone now, torn down, but I can't help wondering if the person or whatever was out there ever really left that land. Every fall, when the air gets dry and the wind moves through the fields, I remember that sound, the slow crunch of footsteps circling the cabin, and I know deep down it wasn't just the wind. It was the autumn of 2017 when I decided to take a week off work and escape to the countryside in the north of England. I'd been living in Birmingham, constantly surrounded by noise, people, and traffic. I was tired, mentally more than physically, and I thought a bit of isolation would clear my head. A friend of mine knew a man who rented out small wooden cabins in Northumberland, near the edge of a forest that led to miles of open moorland. It sounded perfect. I didn't think much about safety or company. I just wanted silence. The cabin was small, made of dark wood that looked aged from the weather. It sat at the edge of a forest road, surrounded by tall trees that blocked most of the wind. There was no one else nearby, just another abandoned-looking shed about 200 meters away that leaned slightly to one side. The man who gave me the key barely spoke. He handed it over, told me to make sure I locked up at night, and left in his truck before I could even ask if there was any phone signal in the area. The first night was fine. I cooked something simple, sat by the small electric heater, and read a bit before bed. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable yet. It's a strange kind of quiet in those places. No cars, no people, no hum of city life. Just the wind moving through trees and the occasional creak of wood. I left one small light on in the kitchen because total darkness made me uneasy. By the second day, the weather had changed. It was gray and misty from morning until late evening. The fog hung low over the trees, and even walking a few steps away from the cabin felt like stepping into a white wall. I stayed inside most of the day, writing a few notes in a small journal I brought with me, drinking coffee, trying to enjoy the stillness. But something about that fog made me feel like I wasn't alone. Not in a supernatural way, just in that instinctive sense that you get when you feel eyes on you. That night, I went outside for a bit before bed. The fog had thinned, but the woods still looked strange in the dim light. I remember standing by the steps of the cabin, looking down the narrow dirt path that led toward the shed I'd noticed earlier. Something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a reflection or some movement caused by the wind. But then I noticed a figure, a person, standing completely still near the shed. The shape was faint, but I could see it clearly enough to know it was a woman. She was wearing something light-colored, maybe a gray coat or dress, and she wasn't moving. She was just standing there, facing my direction. I stared for a few seconds, trying to figure out what she was doing there. Maybe she was lost? Maybe it was a local checking on me? But it was already past 10 p.m., and I hadn't seen anyone around all day. The fog made it hard to judge distance, but she wasn't close enough for me to make out her face. I went back inside after a minute, locked the door, and tried not to overthink it. Rural areas sometimes have odd people walking around, and I told myself it wasn't my business. The next morning, I checked outside first thing. There were no footprints near the shed or anywhere around. The ground was damp enough that footprints should have shown. That detail stuck with me all day. I couldn't get it out of my mind. On the third night, it rained heavily. The sound of it hitting the roof was constant. Around midnight, I woke up because I thought I heard something else. A knocking sound, faint but steady, came from outside, near the back window. I didn't move at first. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to stop. After a few seconds, it did. I tried to calm myself, thinking it might have been branches tapping against the glass in the wind. The rain eased off about an hour later, and curiosity got the better of me. I got up quietly, put on my jacket, and went to the back window. I switched on the small light above the sink and pulled the curtain slightly. There was nothing outside but wet grass and trees. The shed was just a faint outline in the distance. But then, at the edge of the tree line, I saw her again. The same woman standing completely still, facing the cabin. Her clothes looked darker this time, probably soaked from the rain. She didn't move even when the light hit the window. I turned off the light quickly and stepped away. My heartbeat felt heavy in my chest. I sat in the dark for a long time, waiting for her to leave, but I didn't dare look again. In the morning, I checked again. No one was there. I walked to the edge of the forest, even went near the shed, though I didn't go inside. The shed was empty except for some rusted tools, an old chair, and a pile of wood. I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things, that maybe my eyes were playing tricks because of the fog and the dim light. But it didn't explain the knocking. By the 5th day, I was counting down the hours until I could leave. I didn't sleep much that night, and around 4 a.m., I heard something again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. My dog, who had been silent most of the trip, started growling quietly from his bed near the heater. That growl made my blood run cold. He only did that when someone was near. The steps were faint but clear enough to follow. They stopped near the front porch, then shifted toward the back. I didn't move, didn't even breathe loudly. After a few minutes, the sound faded away. When daylight came, I checked all around the cabin. There were wet footprints, small ones women's size, in the mud near the back wall. They led toward the trees and disappeared into the undergrowth. That was it for me. I packed everything within an hour, even though I had one more night left. I locked the door and started the car, planning to return the key later that morning. But when I got to the main road, I saw something that made me stop. About 100 meters ahead, standing by the side of the narrow road, was the same woman. Her clothes were dry now, and her posture was the same. Stiff, arms by her sides, head slightly tilted. I couldn't see her face properly through the mist, but I could tell she was watching me. My first thought was to drive past her and not look back, but something in me hesitated. I stopped the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. She didn't move. She just stood there, silent, in the middle of nowhere. I pressed down on the accelerator and didn't slow down until I reached the nearest petrol station about 20 miles away. When I got out, I felt shaky, not because of what I saw, but because I couldn't explain it. She wasn't a ghost or some vision. She was real, a real woman, flesh and blood, and she'd been watching that cabin for days. Later, when I handed the key back, I casually mentioned that someone might have been around the property. The man just looked at me blankly, said there shouldn't have been anyone there, and asked if I'd locked up properly. I nodded, but I didn't tell him everything. I never went back to that place, and I didn't talk about it much either. But sometimes, when I think about that week, I still remember how she stood there, silent, motionless, as if waiting for something. Maybe she was a local woman who wandered the woods. Maybe she was hiding from someone. Or maybe she was watching to see who came and went, living quietly in those trees. What still unsettles me isn't just that she was there. It's that she knew I was alone. She knew when I slept, when I moved, when I turned on the lights. Every sound, every movement in that cabin, she must have known. And I'll never know why she chose to watch me, or if she ever stopped watching after I left. It had been almost a year since my ex-husband, Daniel, passed away. Even now, I still hadn't figured out what to do with the cabin we used to own together in northern Minnesota. It sat deep in the woods near a small, half-forgotten lake that most people didn't even know existed. We had bought it back when we were still married, thinking it would be our peaceful getaway. But after the divorce, I stopped going there. He'd kept it, and after he died, alone from a heart attack at 48, it became mine again. For months, I avoided dealing with it. I didn't want to see that place. Every memory in that cabin was tangled up with him. His clothes still hanging in the closet, his handwriting on scraps of paper, his coffee mug chipped at the rim. But the property taxes were piling up, and I couldn't afford to just let it sit there. I decided I'd drive up one weekend in late October to clean it out, take photos, and list it for sale. It was cold that morning when I left Duluth. The air felt sharp, and the sky was that pale gray color that always makes you think snow might come early. The drive north took almost 4 hours, most of it through empty back roads lined with trees stripped bare from the wind. I didn't see a single car once I turned off the main highway. The dirt road that led to the cabin was rougher than I remembered. Muddy in places, narrow in others. Fallen branches scraped the sides of my old SUV as I crawled along. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked worse than I expected. The wood siding had gone gray from weather. The roof was streaked with black moss. Weeds had grown up around the porch steps, and the air smelled damp and earthy, like rot and pine needles. I parked near the edge of the clearing and sat for a few minutes, staring at the front door. I felt this strange heaviness in my chest, like I was walking into a life that didn't belong to me anymore. Inside, the air was cold and stale. Dust floated in the light coming through the windows. The furniture was still there. The old plaid couch, the wooden dining table we found at a flea market, the bookshelf with his fishing magazines still lined up neatly. Everything was just as he'd left it, except now it felt lifeless. I started working right away. I had boxes in the car, garbage bags, cleaning supplies. I went room to room, sorting things into piles, what could be kept, what could be thrown away. Most of his clothes were still hanging in the small bedroom closet. Some still smelled faintly of his cologne, which made my stomach twist. His boots were by the door, covered in dried mud. His fishing gear was stacked in the corner by the window. I tried not to think too much as I packed it all. By late afternoon, the light outside had started fading. It got dark fast out there, with the trees blocking the sky. I made myself a sandwich and sat at the table, listening to the quiet. No traffic, no voices, not even wind. Just silence so thick it pressed on my ears. That's when I first noticed something strange. There was a faint, rhythmic creaking sound. It came from somewhere behind the cabin, soft at first, then stopping completely. I thought maybe it was just the wind shifting the old boards or maybe a loose shutter. But a few minutes later, it came again. 3 slow creaks, then silence. I stepped outside with my flashlight. The woods behind the cabin were dense, the kind that seemed to swallow sound. I swept the beam of light around but saw nothing but trees and dead leaves. I told myself it was probably an animal brushing against something, maybe a branch rubbing against the siding. Still, it bothered me enough that I decided to check around back. The ground was soft from recent rain, and my shoes sank slightly as I walked. When I reached the back wall of the cabin, I found the source, or at least I thought I did. There was an old wooden swing still hanging from the big pine tree behind the cabin, the one Daniel built years ago. The ropes were frayed now, and one side had come loose, so the seat hung crooked. The wind must have caught it, I thought. That explained the sound. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to relax. But the noise didn't stop. Every so often, that same creaking sound would echo faintly, almost like footsteps on a wooden floor far away. It wasn't the swing, I was sure of it now. I could feel it like someone was outside walking slowly around the cabin. I checked the door again, made sure it was locked, then went into the bedroom to grab my phone. No signal. I hadn't expected there to be any. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was an old cabin, old with shifts. Animals move around at night. It was all explainable. But then, around 9, I noticed something that didn't fit. On the floor near the back door, muddy boot prints. Fresh, large. They led from the door to the table, then stopped near the hallway. I froze. I hadn't been near the back door all day. I walked over slowly and looked closer. The prints were half dried, but they hadn't been there earlier when I cleaned that area. They weren't mine either. These were from heavy work boots, at least a size bigger than mine. I checked the back door. Still locked. No broken glass. No sign anyone had come in. But someone had been inside. Recently, I stood in the center of the room, listening. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it echoed in my throat. I couldn't hear anything else, but I could feel something. Like the kind of tension you get when someone's near you, even if you can't see them. I didn't want to stay there another second. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and my flashlight, and I went to the front door. But when I pulled it open, the porch light flickered once and went out completely. I stood there, breathing cold air, staring at the black woods stretching out in every direction. My car was parked about 50 feet away, barely visible. I decided I'd make a run for it. I locked the cabin behind me, sprinted across the clearing, and yanked the car door open. I got inside, slammed the lock down, and sat there shaking. My headlights lit up the clearing, the cabin standing there still and quiet. Then I saw movement. At first I thought it was my eyes adjusting, but then I saw it again. Someone moving behind the front window, just barely visible through the glass. A shadow shifting past the curtain. I started the car, reversed fast, and turned onto the dirt road. My hands were trembling so hard I could barely keep control of the wheel. The road twisted and bounced under me, branches scraping the sides. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway nearly 40 minutes later. I drove straight to the nearest motel I could find, a small place outside of Grand Rapids, and stayed there for the night. I didn't sleep much. Every noise in the building made me flinch. The next morning, I called the sheriff's office. They sent someone to check the property. The deputy I spoke to later said they found the back door still locked, just like I'd left it. Nothing stolen, nothing broken. But there were footprints outside, large ones, leading from the edge of the woods straight to the back door, then circling the cabin several times. He said it was probably a hunter passing through, maybe looking for shelter. But I knew that wasn't true. Those prints inside weren't just from someone passing through. They'd been standing near the table, watching. I sold the cabin a month later to a couple from out of state. I never went back there again. Sometimes, though, I still think about that night, about how quiet it was before I noticed the sound, about how the prints started near the back door but ended by the table, like someone had stood there for a long time, just waiting. And I can't stop wondering about one thing, the old swing behind the cabin. When I left that night, I remember seeing it in my rearview mirror. It wasn't hanging crooked anymore. It was moving, slow and steady, back and forth, as if someone had just stepped away from it. It was late October of 2014 when I decided to stay for a few days in an old cabin that sat right next to a forgotten graveyard on the edge of rural Tennessee. I had found it through a friend of mine who said it used to belong to his uncle, a man who worked as a groundskeeper for the small cemetery nearby until he passed away years ago. I was 32 then, and I had been going through a rough stretch. My job was slipping out of my hands. My marriage had already ended months before, and my apartment in the city felt suffocating. I thought a few quiet days alone might clear my head, maybe even give me a little peace. I didn't go looking for anything scary. I just wanted silence. The drive there was long and almost empty. The paved roads eventually turned into cracked gravel paths lined with bare trees, their branches arching over the road like bones. The air felt heavy as I drove deeper into the countryside. It had rained earlier that morning, and the smell of damp dirt came through the cracks of the car window. When I finally saw the cabin, it was smaller than I expected. Just one floor, a rusted tin roof, and a faded front door that looked like it hadn't been painted in decades. Behind it, through a narrow path, I could see the outlines of old gravestones, hundreds of them scattered unevenly across the overgrown grass. The cabin had no power lines running to it. The only thing inside was an old wood stove, a few oil lamps, a creaky table, and a small cot with a thin mattress. I remember the floorboards felt soft under my boots, like they had soaked up years of rain and rot. The place smelled faintly of mold and something metallic, maybe rust from the old stove. Still, I told myself it would do. I wasn't there for comfort anyway. That first night, I lit a fire and sat on the small porch, watching the sun go down behind the trees. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. The graveyard was about 50 yards away, separated by nothing more than a thin wire fence that sagged in the middle. Most of the headstones were tilted, names barely visible. I tried not to stare at them too long, but it was hard not to. The whole place had that quiet kind of stillness that felt unnatural. Not peaceful, but hollow. I turned in early, laying on the cot, listening to the steady ticking of the stove cooling down. At some point in the night, I woke up to a sound outside, a dull, steady scraping noise. It wasn't close at first, just somewhere in the distance near the graveyard. I lay still for a while, trying to tell myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon digging through the leaves. But the noise kept coming, slow and rhythmic, like something being dragged over the ground. It would stop for a few seconds, then start again. After about 5 minutes, it went quiet completely. I stayed awake for another hour before I drifted off again. The next morning, I went outside and walked toward the graveyard. The ground was wet and soft from the rain, and I could see fresh tracks. Not footprints exactly, but long marks where something had been dragged across the mud. They led from the far end of the cemetery toward the back fence and disappeared into the trees. I stood there for a while, staring at them, feeling a strange unease I couldn't quite explain. I didn't see anyone else around, and there were no signs of recent visitors. I tried not to think too much about it and went back to the cabin. The rest of the day passed quietly. I collected firewood, boiled some water, and read an old paperback I had brought. By sunset, I felt a little calmer, even though the wind had picked up and the air smelled of rain again. That night, though, I couldn't fall asleep as easily. I kept hearing faint noises outside, small thuds, the creak of wood, maybe branches hitting the roof. Around midnight, I heard that scraping again, this time closer, coming from the side of the cabin. It was a slow, dragging sound, almost deliberate. I sat up in bed, staring toward the window, trying to listen over the sound of my own breathing. Then it stopped suddenly, just as before. The next morning, I checked around the cabin again. The ground was disturbed near the back wall. Small patches of dirt dug up like someone had been trying to bury something shallow. I found a broken shovel half buried under a pile of leaves not far from there. The handle was cracked in two, and the metal part was caked in mud. It looked old, but not ancient. I thought maybe it had been left by the groundskeeper years ago, or by some hiker. Still, something about it felt wrong, like it hadn't been there long enough to rust. By the third day, I was jumpy. Every small noise made me look over my shoulder. Around noon, I decided to take a long walk through the graveyard to clear my head. I noticed that several of the graves near the far end had sunken in, the dirt uneven and soft, like it had been disturbed recently. One of the headstones had fallen completely over, and beneath it, the ground looked freshly dug. I crouched down to touch it, and the soil crumbled apart like it had been turned over just a day or two before. I didn't see any footprints, but the same dragging marks led back toward the woods. I followed them for a short distance before they disappeared into a patch of tall grass. That evening, the temperature dropped fast. The air was damp and freezing, and fog rolled in thick from the hills. I could barely see the graveyard from the porch anymore. I stayed inside, trying to focus on keeping the fire going. I remember the smell of the burning wood filling the room, the faint creak of the old cabin settling in the cold. I was just starting to doze off when I heard something hit the back wall. A dull thud, heavy and solid. Then another. It wasn't random this time. It came in steady intervals, like someone hitting the same spot over and over with something blunt. I froze, staring at the wall, my hands shaking. After a few minutes, it stopped. The silence after that was worse than the noise itself. At sunrise, I forced myself to go look. Behind the cabin, right where the thudding had come from, I found a large patch of disturbed dirt, deeper than before. It looked like someone had been digging again, but this time there was no shovel, just claw marks in the mud, long and uneven. I backed away slowly, feeling my stomach twist. It didn't make sense. No person would dig with their hands like that, not in freezing weather. I went back inside, locked the door, and packed my things. I didn't care that I had planned to stay longer. Whatever was going on there, I didn't want to find out. When I left the cabin that morning, I noticed something else. A small wooden cross had been placed on the porch overnight. It wasn't there before. It was simple. 2 sticks tied together with a thin strip of fabric, stuck upright between the floorboards. The fabric looked old, like torn clothing. I didn't touch it. I just stepped around it, threw my bag into the truck, and drove off as fast as the rough road would allow. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main highway. When I looked back in the mirror for the last time, the cabin was barely visible through the fog, sitting there beside the rows of tilting graves. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw when I got back, not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't know how to explain it myself. There was no ghost, no strange figure chasing me. Just those sounds, those fresh graves, and the feeling that something had been moving out there when it shouldn't have been. A few weeks later, out of curiosity, I tried to look up the old cemetery online. There wasn't much information, just a few notes about it being abandoned since the late 1980s. The most recent record mentioned something about local authorities finding evidence of grave tampering. Old graves being dug up, soil disturbed, a few bones missing. They never found out who did it. The article said they assumed it was grave robbers, but that didn't make much sense for such a forgotten place. Every once in a while, especially when it rains and the air smells like wet soil, I think about that cabin and that graveyard behind it. I can still picture the way the fog rolled in that last morning and how quiet everything was before I drove away. It's been years now, but I'll never forget how that silence felt. Not empty, but waiting.